Chapter 441, Preventing the Holocaust. Monday, November 25, 1996, Stein Residency Los Angeles, California, United States of America. Atlantis DEFCON status. 335% next up. One of these popes is not like the other. 75-year-old Abraham Stein looked at the news bulletin in amazement. He couldn't tell whether he should be overjoyed or deeply disturbed. South African Ministry of Magic acts to halt genocide in Burundi. Associated Press, in a development hailed as a breakthrough in the long struggle between the Hutu and Tutsi peoples in Rwanda and Botswana, the United Nations have called upon the South African Ministry of Magic to stop recent genocidal activity against the Tutsi population. Michael Rourke, the South African Minister of Magic, explains, "It was fairly obvious that the United States would not be able to trust any Hutu or Tutsi people when it came to stopping these horrific crimes against humanity. A third party was needed to oversee the operation, and that is where we came in." The South African Wizards' response was quite simple. Taking advantage of the fact that neither Rwanda nor Burundi has a functioning Ministry of Magic, they cast a spell which would ensure that any unnatural Hutu deaths would be reported to the nearest Hutu wizard, and vice versa, within a matter of seconds. As a result, criminals who committed crimes against humanity soon found themselves dealing with very angry wizards with wands in their hands. The solution isn't perfect, Rourke says. It still allows for the possibility that wizards can continue the fighting against each other. However, the fact remains that, for the vaster majority of people, the genocide can no longer continue unless the attackers figure out ways to defend themselves against magic. This action will save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. This solution went into effect November 1st, and since then, the number of incidents of ethnic cleansing in the two nations has dropped by 70%. Many people in the area are overjoyed that the wizards are finally halting this terrible struggle. A 37-year-old man named Nduwimana explains, "Every few days or so, a warlord would lead his posse down the street and start shooting people at random. I lost my 9-year-old son that way, and although I wanted to avenge myself on the Hutus, I realized that two wrongs did not make a right, and that any revenge I took would just exacerbate the problem. Thanks to the actions of the South African wizards, we can start to come out again knowing that if the warlords try to do anything, they will be caught immediately." Many other nations are watching this development with interest in case they have to deal with fighting ethnic groups themselves. Although the events of Judgment Day have caused the Israelis and the Palestinians to bury the hatchet for the time being, there are many organizations who are warning that a long period of complacency might restart the fighting there again. Although it appears that the Israeli Ministry of Magic has brought in members of a giant tribe known as the Nephilim to Kant. Page Tool, though Stein felt happy that a crime against humanity had been thwarted, it made him wonder why the Atlantis, or at least the local ministries of magic in Europe, had not taken more action against genocides of the past, particularly his own. He rolled up his sleeve and looked at the number tattooed on his arm, 567,178. He'd gotten that number in Dachau back in 1943. If the South Africans were able to stop, or at least reduce the effect of genocidal tendencies in Rwanda and Burundi, what would a more organized ministry of magic like that of Germany have been able to do? Would the ministry have been able to save his mother, father, and brother from the gas chambers? Stein knew enough about the wizards to realize that the statute of secrecy would have been in effect in those days. However, he couldn't help but think that there must have been a way to save the inmates of the various concentration camps without violating the statute of secrecy. What about rescuing the inmates and then obliviating them, replacing their memories of the wizards with memories of Allied soldiers or humanitarian Germans like Oskar Schindler? How about preventing future deportations by causing magical fire to rage through Auschwitz shortly after it was constructed, burning it to the ground and blaming it on a lightning strike. There had to have been something the wizards could have done to preserve their precious statute, yet they had refused to act. Could it have been because the wizards in the German Ministry of Magic had also been Nazis? He had to admit that could have been a possibility, in which case he had to place the blame partially in Atlantis's lap, as well for not overriding the genocidal tendencies of the Nazi wizards. Atlantis must have known what was going on at the time. There were rumors of a wizard named Gellert, Grendel, Wald, who had fought for the Germans during the Second World War. Atlantis must have known that the atrocities inherent in an international conflict could only be remedied by a major international effort. And who would be responsible for a major international effort when it came to magic? Atlantis. Stein paced around his room angrily. He knew enough about Atlantis to know that they wouldn't intervene unless civilization as a whole was endangered. That was all well and good. However, who was supposed to watch out for endangered ethnic groups which did not have a ministry of magic to protect them? Atlantis had to wean itself off that laissez-faire attitude when it came to supervising the world. What use was it otherwise? Stein had to do something. But what? Carrillo household? Steve Carrillo looked at the reporter in amazement. We're up to 2,700 people now. The reporter nodded. Yes, Mr. Carrillo. Your lawsuit about being obliviated and demanding compensation appears to have touched a lot of nerves around here. We're at 2,700 now, and it's likely to grow even further. Amazing. And to think the trial isn't for a few more months. This is probably going to be the talk of the town. Quite possibly. Remind me of your story again. Carrillo complied. I'd always thought I'd been abducted by aliens, and they performed experiments on me. However, it's fairly obvious now that it wasn't aliens. It was wizards who made me think that I was abducted by aliens. I'm half expecting that I'm going grow a third leg, or something like that as soon as a wizard casts a spell in my vicinity. The reporter frowned. Why would a wizard do that? Carrillo shrugged. Beats me. I don't pretend to know how those wizards think. Do you understand them? No, sir, I don't. At any rate, let's get on with the interview. Would you be interested in knowing that Oprah Winfrey wants to put you on her show? Carrillo's jaw dropped. I'm going to be on Oprah. Yes, Mr. Carrillo. What do you say about that? Carrillo hesitated. I'm personally not a big fan of opera. However, I can't help but admit that my sister is. When are they thinking of putting me on? The reporter gave him a card. Early next year, or so I've been told. If you're interested, call this number here and we'll get the ball rolling. You may have 2,700 people involved now. After a gig on opera, however, you can easily get 10,000. Carrillo grinned. I'm going to be famous in more ways than one. Sister Claire, eat your heart out. Chapter 442. The Story of Pope Joan. Monday, November 25, 19,962, Florem das Librariumge Instituterheimbeck, United States of America. Atlantis DEFCON status. 335% next up. Damsels without dirigibles Pope, or was it Cohen Gaddle? John Paul Roman II looked over the note he had retrieved from the Ministry of Magic. He had expected that there would be a lot of people in attendance at this talk, and he hadn't been disappointed. Virtually every single Christian clergyman was in the room, as were a large number of the non-Christians. Samuel and Deborah were absent, however, as even ghosts couldn't be in two places at the same time. The title of the talk was rather innocuous, A Brief History of the Life of Pope John Roman XX on the occasion of John XX's feast day. At first glance, it looked like many other of the talks given by religious scholars during the conference. However, one thing stood out about this particular talk. There had never been a Pope John Roman XX. There had been a John Roman XIX and a John Roman XXI, but there had never been a John Roman XX. The official explanation was because of a bookkeeping error in the early church records, and most of the world had been satisfied with that. However, the wizards knew the truth. The wizards knew all about the person known as John Roman 20, who, after all, had been one of their own. Waiting a few minutes after the scheduled start time for stragglers to make their way into the room, he brought out his notebook and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, clergy and laity, thank you for coming to my talk. Today I will be discussing the career of a little-known pope, John Roman 20. This unique individual was a major religious figure of the 13th century and oversaw the Holy See between the years 1269 and 1271. This pope succeeded Clement Roman IV and preceded Gregory X. There was an astonished gasp from the crowd, which John Paul had expected. Inevitably, someone at the back of the room raised his hand. The pontiff nodded at him and smiled. I have a funny feeling I know what you're going to ask, but go ahead. The listener chuckled. Thank you, Holiness. Although I can't be entirely certain, I could have sworn that there was no pope between Clement Roman IV and Gregory X, only a 3-year sede vacante. Furthermore, I could have also sworn that there was no John Roman 20. John Paul nodded. Excellent question, Cardinal. Indeed, if you look at most of the religious textbooks we were taught from, you would have been correct. Clement Roman IV died in 1268 and was succeeded by Gregory X in 1271. However, you have to consider the possibility that John Roman 20 was stricken from the history books for some odd reason. That is why John Roman 20 remains anonymous, and why the next John didn't take the name John Roman 20. The cardinal shook his head. How can an entire papal reign be stripped from the records? You can't just lose a pope, even someone who reigned for only 3 years. We have records from men who had much shorter reigns, even in the Middle Ages. John Paul smiled. Simple. Everyone was instructed to forget about John. Why? What did he do? Was he an apostate, anti-pope, or something like that? Did he father children out of wedlock? John Paul shrugged. Nope, and even if John had done so, that would not have been enough to get the Pope kicked out of the list. We've got the Borgias in the list, and they weren't exactly people Christ would have been proud of. Then what happened? And where'd you get this information from? John Paul winked at him. The wizards, of course. Recall that I am a wizard, and the wizards did not remove John Roman 20 from the papal registry. Murmurs went through the audience as the pontiff's interrogator thought for a moment. Finally, it occurred to him. Are you telling me that John Roman 20 was a wizard? The Pope's smile broadened. Of course not. John Roman 20 was not a wizard. Then what was he? A witch, Cardinal. She was a witch. All that's left of her reign is the legend of Pope Joan. The audience erupted in amazement, as John Paul knew they would have. Some of the more conservative members looked a bit upset, but they respected John Paul too much to leave. Several of the liberals cheered, as did all of the women and most of the wizards. A witch as a pope. Who'd have even thought of this? John Paul waited for the din to subside and began his story. The woman we now know as Pope John Roman 20 was born in Ferrara, Italy, in early 1218 to the then powerful Amarlina wizarding family. Both of her parents were wizards, and they found that she was a brilliant student as soon as she entered school. She was tested for wizarding ability and admitted to the wizarding school at Beauxbatons, where she graduated a year early in 1234 and earned the position of head girl. The documents I received from Beauxbatons indicate that people revered the teenage Maria, Amarlina, in the same way they revere Hermione Granger today. There was one major difference, however. The statute of secrecy was not yet in force, so she was allowed to cast spells in the presence of Muggles in certain situations. Everyone expected her to be Ferrara's representative in her kingdom's Ministry of Magic when she got older. It was not surprising, therefore, that she got an internship in the wizarding government of Ferrara almost immediately after she graduated. She didn't do anything big, but it was enough for her to put her foot in the door. When she turned 17 and came of age, her position became permanent, and she began making her way up the corporate ladder, so to speak. In 1237, while working at her position in Ferrara, she met a wealthy Muggle named Vittorio Gandolfo in the Muggle liaison office. The two of them hit it off almost immediately, and in early 1230, the Gandolfos and the Amarlinas agreed to the proposed marriage. Amarlina and Gandolfo were married in late 1238, and their son Antonio was born in January 1240. Our future pope seemed well on her way to becoming a powerful member of wizarding Italy. However, life took an unexpected turn for her. Her husband proved to be extremely religious, and she agreed to increase her level of observance somewhat so that little Antonio could be given a decent Catholic upbringing. Unfortunately, Vittorio's piety caused him to make a terrible mistake, signing up for the Crusade of 1241. Hoping to come back with some plunder for his growing family, he went off to the Holy Land. He came back in a body bag, a Saracen arrow through his throat. John Paul took a sip of water and continued. Maria was devastated by this turn of events, and she sought solace by spending time visiting a convent in Ferrara. She eventually got to know many of the nuns and found that life in a nunnery seemed to fit her scholarly personality. As a result, in 1246, Maria Amarlina made arrangements to have her son homeschooled by wizards so she could join as a full-time sister. Once that was done, she left her career in the ministry behind her and became a nun, Sister Mary Joanna. Sister Mary Joanna enjoyed life as a nun and used her magic a great deal to help the women get by and improve the lives of the people in and around the nunnery. The Mother Superior picked her out for special services almost immediately, and by the time she was 45, she had been elevated to Mother Superior. By the time Mary Joanna had taken the corner office, so to speak, the convent had become renowned through the world for its mixture of Muggle and wizarding artifacts, as well as for its comfortable lifestyle made possible by the presence of a witch in the house. Mary Joanna, who soon started going simply by Joanna, because a good 50% of the sisters were Mary something, promptly began doing things which attracted the attention of ministries of magic and clergy all over the world. She was using spells to feed the hungry, clothe the sick, and so forth. She encouraged study, both magical and mundane, and the convent's library became one of the wonders of Ferrara. Imagine a cross between Hermione Granger and Mother Teresa, and you probably won't be far off. Meanwhile, she received word that her son Antonio had graduated Durmstrang after having served a prefect. Antonio proved to be as capable a wizard and as religious as she and her late husband had been, a combination which would get both him and Joanna into trouble later. By 1267, Joanna had cemented her reputation as a powerful witch, well-respected abbess, great scholar, and gifted diplomat. She had made connections all over Europe among the wizards, the Muggles, and the clergy. At a time when Italy was becoming increasingly divided, Joanna was one of the few people everyone could agree upon. The crowd started murmuring again. It was fairly obvious what was going to happen next. The pontiff continued. Now we get to history as you know it. In September 1268, Pope Clement Roman IV died, and the conclave deadlocked over whom to name as his successor. The deadlock continued for a couple of months, and people started to get fed up. Finally, in early 1269, one of the Muggles in the conclave joked that they should make Joanna the Pope. This, of course, got the wizarding cardinals talking. They brought out some old texts, yet it took them a good 30 minutes to convince the rest of the conclave that, in theory, a female wizard was preferable to a male Muggle. Suddenly, people began thinking that a puppet Joanna under a fake name might be a good consensus candidate. People agreed that Joanna had the personality suited to be a good pope. However, a good 75% of the members of the conclave refused to go along with a woman as pope. They eventually agreed to consider Joanna if, and only if, they couldn't find anyone else they could agree on. Which, of course, proved to be the case. Finally, in March 1279, the conclave caved in and elected Joanna pope. Joanna was absolutely astounded by this decision and claimed that she was better suited for a life at the nunnery. However, She eventually agreed to take the title as long as the conclave continued searching for another option. She took a leave of absence from the nunnery for private meditation, donned a monk's robes, and came to Rome as Brother Marius. The cardinals immediately escorted her to St. Peter's Basilica, where she was declared Pope John Roman XX. Her magical roots and gender were known only to the cardinals, the wizards, and the nuns at her convent. When she spoke in public, she took advantage of the fact that a healthy lifestyle as a witch made her about as tall as most men. She also had a deep voice, so she could pass as a man very easily. She took office on March 22, 1279, and didn't have any major problems for the first 2 years. The baggy ceremonial robes hid her figure, and the fact that she was 51 at her coronation made it so that she was too old for her to exhibit other issues pertaining to her gender. Her career proved to be, well, mundane. She was a good pope, but so were many of her colleagues. There weren't any disasters during her reign, nor were there many earth-shattering triumphs. She was probably like many of the other popes in the Middle Ages, people whom we have long forgotten. The pontiff grimaced. Everything changed, however, in 1270, when her son Antonio's religious fervor got the best of him. Determined to avenge his father's death at the hands of the Saracens, Antonio enlisted in what we now know as the Eighth Crusade. For the longest time, he hid his magical abilities because he was scared of how the more conservative pilgrims would react. Nevertheless, in early 1271, the pilgrims were ambushed by a Saracen patrol and would have likely been annihilated had Antonio not used magic to defend them. The Saracens fled, of course, as did a good half of the pilgrims, thinking that Satan had infiltrated the Crusader forces. Antonio, finding himself confronted with a horde of angry Crusaders, explained that he was a wizard and that his father John Roman XX would explain everything. This raised eyebrows all over the world. Was John Roman XX actually a supporter of wizards, even though the Bible said magic was forbidden? And what was this about a supposedly celibate man having children? Needless to say, the church started an investigation. The cardinals tried to cover everything up as much as they could, but inevitably word leaked out that John Roman XX was actually the former witch Mother Joanna. Not surprisingly, Christendom had collective apoplexy when they realized that they had elected a female pope. Kings all over Europe began demanding that Joanna resign and submit herself for punishment. She refused, claiming that wizards were preferable to Muggles when it came to dealing with spiritual dangers like the devil. She explained the hierarchy as we know it: wizard, witch, Muggle man, Muggle woman. Since there were no wizards nominated in the conclave, the papacy went to her. They promptly asked her which of her predecessors had been wizards. She didn't say, simply because it was extremely bad form to expose people as wizards without permission. Unfortunately, this refusal weakened her case, and the protests against her continued. She was able to fend off her adversaries for a while. However, in May 1271, the reduced Crusader army suffered a serious defeat in battle, which proved to be a mixed blessing for Joanna. Her son had survived and had been made an important commander, but her flock started screaming that the Saracen victory was a sign from God that the woman had to be taken off the throne of St. Peter. Eventually, even the cardinals started pressuring her, and in June 1271, she agreed to resign and return to the convent. She would continue serving as Mother Superior until her death on this date in 1316. John looked around the room and saw that everyone was still looking at him with rapt attention. Meanwhile, the papal conclave, which had been convened in 1268, continued its deliberations, this time with much greater fervor now that their interim pope had been deposed. Finally, in November 1271, they agreed to elect Gregory ex-pope. Gregory, who had studied a lot about the wizarding world, explained that there had been 4 wizarding popes before John, and that he did not know who they were. He confirmed Joanna's interpretation of the conclave hierarchy, but recommended that future conclaves not elect witches as popes for the sake of unity within Christendom. Technically, the law permitted witches as popes. However, in practice, they were just too controversial. The deposition of Joanna triggered a troubling backlash against wizards and nuns. Eventually, the wizards realized that only way to stop the fighting and maintain a unified front against the Saracens would be to obliviate everyone into thinking Joanna had never been pope, and that she had spent 1269–1271 safely ensconced in her nunnery. The wizards set to work doing this as Atlantis went to DEFCON 3. By the time 1285 had rolled around, virtually no one outside the wizarding world had any proof that Joanna had ever been pope. After some discussion with the wizards and papal scribes, people began publicizing the theory that there had been a sede vacante throughout Joanna's reign, in that an inappropriate person had been pope. And if you take a look at the textbooks, that's exactly what you'll read today. John Paul drew a deep breath as he finally finished his speech. When the next pope named John came around, people told him that he could take the name John Roman 20 if he so chose. He refused, however, as he didn't want to be associated with a name which for some reason had cursed connotations. So he became John Roman 21, and history, as we know it, continues from there. Well, that's all I have. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. A forest of hands appeared on the floor. John Paul winced. This was going to take a while. Chapter 443. Nestor invades Círdan. Tuesday, November 26, 1996. Tipsy Troll, Insilvar Southeastern Círdan Atlantis, DEFCON status. 337%. Next up. Only Ted Williams can hit 400 more. He put down his butter beer as he looked at the newspaper thoughtfully. The article discussed several recent rulings by the Muggle sports organization known as the International Olympic Committee. This committee was responsible for putting on an international sporting event every 4 years, or was it 2? The wizard who had written the article hadn't been sure, in which athletes all around the world set aside their differences for a couple of weeks and engaged in some friendly competition. Morny was fully in support of such an organization. Perhaps it would do for the vast majority of uneducated Muggles what the Quidditch World Cup did for decent wizards. Maybe it would distract the United States enough to ensure that the Muggle superpower wouldn't attack Círdan. At any rate, the IARC had just reported that it had discovered anomalies during the 1996 edition of the Olympic Games. Specifically, it had ruled that the French fourth-place finish in one of the relay races had been a result of magical foul play, which was not appropriate for games in an international competition. In other words, someone had hexed the French runner just to make sure that the French didn't win. Morn chuckled when he read that. Apparently, the Free Muggles were as prone to cheating as the wizards were. The IARC had decided that since the wizard who had been responsible for the attack had been a citizen of the nation which had placed third, the cheater's nation would surrender its bronze medal to the French. The cheater had protested vigorously, of course, but to no avail. The IARC warned people that magic would be considered the equivalent of a performance-enhancing drug in future Olympics, and that athletes and fans would not be allowed to use magic to influence the outcomes of the races. In other news, the IARC also reported that Quidditch would be added to the Winter Olympic program starting in 2002, when the Quidditch World Cup would become part of the Olympic Games. Matches would be limited to 2 hours in duration, and they would be held outdoors in the hemisphere opposite that of the primary Winter Olympics venue. Many of the wizards had recommended that matches be held during the Summer Games, but the IARC had rejected that because it would throw the traditional 4-year cycle of the Quidditch World Cup out of whack. In a decision which had shocked sports fans all over, the Atlantis had recommended that the 2004 Olympic Games be awarded to the capital of Zelenda, the hidden nation which had taken the lead in voluntarily announcing itself to the world. Athletes, guests, and reporters would be issued visas to visit Zelenda, and the Xyland had agreed to deactivate their protector no later than 2001. The Xyland boasted that it would improve tourism and prove that the Xyland were welcoming towards the Muggles of the world. Great, thought Morny. Now all of our yahoos are going to start claiming that they've got Olympic tickets and will want to visit Zalenda. It was becoming increasingly obvious that the recent reforms handed down by the executive committee hadn't been enough to appease the yahoos. If anything, they had whetted the yahoos' appetite and left them clamoring for more. Supposedly, the southwest part of the country was now infested with Siadani Muggle resistance movement cells, and there had been sporadic outbursts of fighting there. Morny wondered how much more the executive committee could give up before the wizards lost control of the Muggles completely. He turned back to his butterbeer and had the drink halfway to his mouth when suddenly everyone in the bar started chattering and whistling excitedly. Curious, he looked towards the entrance and found himself staring into the eyes of the most attractive woman he had ever seen. He spilled his drink on the floor as he ogled her. He was totally smitten with her, and he apparently forgot for a few moments that he was married. Fortunately, his wife wasn't here right now, so he got away with it. Judging from the high-pitched swear and punch he heard a few booths away, one of the other guests hadn't been as lucky. He watched as the woman sashayed into the tavern and asked for a butterbeer. Smiling, she turned and addressed the crowd. She seemed pleased to have gotten their undivided attention. "Good evening, gentlemen. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, but my name is Arot Sensella, and I was wondering if there are any rooms here at the inn. My sorority sisters and I are looking for a place to hold a regional convention, and we were told this place was good." All eyes moved to the proprietor, who had his back to the woman. As he started turning around, he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't." Then he caught sight of the woman. His jaw dropped as he took in the wonderful sight. Eventually, he managed to continue. "I'll see what we can do, ma'am. Most of our rooms are booked, but if you ladies are willing to sleep 2 or 3 to a room, we may be able to house you. How many people will be in your party, ma'am?" In response, the woman whistled, and 10 more women as hot as she was appeared in the doorway. Jerking her head back at the newcomers, the first woman nodded. "We'll start with 50, sir." The proprietor looked at her warily as Morny tried to convince some of his body parts to pretend the women weren't there. 50? We can't fit 50 more people here. However, if you wish, I'll start calling around to see if anyone else has any openings for the people we can't host." The woman nodded. "Please do. We really like this part of the country." Morny watched as the proprietor sent owls out to several of the other inns in the area. Minutes later, the owls returned to report that a large group of women had filled up their rooms as well. One of them went so far as to report that large numbers of attractive women had booked rooms in their establishments as well. Morny blinked. How big was this sorority? And why were they spending time here if there weren't any major universities in this area? Suddenly, one of the men near the front of the room raised his hand. "Hey, Cuddles, you can stay with me. I've got a guest bedroom." His response was echoed by several people, the vast majority of whom did not have wives sitting next to them. The 11 women looked around the room and giggled girlishly. "Wow, wow. How are we supposed to repay you for your hospitality? We really appreciate this." The tipsy troll's patrons spent the next 5 minutes trying to explain it to them. At length, Louise Lemony watched as 6 of her sisters took over the tipsy troll, and 5 others went off with several of the men who had been drinking in the tavern at the time. This was going to be a very good beachhead for Nestor, she thought. This was one inn she had under her control. So far, so good. She turned around to see an entire barnyard's worth of animals heading in her direction. They all had notes in their claws, paws, and hands. They were from several of the other commanders in the expeditionary force. Jessica's division had taken over Sonoda, Michelle was now running Siblin, and Julie was occupying Sizerty even as she wrote the letter. An area a good 20 miles across was now completely enthralled by the young Vila. Louise sent a message back to home base. "All right, Olivia, send the rest of them over. We've got the area secured." 20 minutes later, Morny had left the bar depressed that he hadn't gotten one of the 11 women. Hanging his head, he made his way over to the seacoast to ponder the waves for a moment. Movement caught his eyes, and he looked up into the air where a large flock of birds was flying in his direction. They seemed to be huge birds, however. They were traveling in formation, almost like a bunch of soldiers marching towards a target. And the lark was huge, at least 1,000, possibly more. Suddenly, a thought hit him and his face blanched. He watched as the birds flew over his head and started landing in various positions on the ground. One of them landed near him, blurred for a moment, and suddenly transformed itself into another attractive young woman. And at that moment, he suddenly realized what he was seeing. He thought back to the woman's name at the bar, Arat Sensela, or if you wrote it backwards, Nestora Rules. He brought his wand out and pointed it at the woman. Merlin's beard, your Vila, this is a Nestorian invasion. The woman shrugged and disarmed him. I wouldn't spread that around if I were you. You could get yourself killed. If I were you, I'd ask for obliviation or cooperate with us. Morny looked around frantically for his wand, only to find it in the woman's hand. Hoping he sounded threatening, he said, I am no traitor, Vila. I know what you animals are trying to do. What's more, I know you won't kill me as you don't kill civilians unless there's no alternative. You're going to let me go right now. The Vila grunted and pointed her wand at him. I'd say exposing our forces is a major risk, sir. How have you been keeping up with your religious duties? I hope the 5 guards accept your soul. Morny cringed. No, please don't. The Vila looked at him again. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, she put her wand away and picked up something which appeared to be a metal tube with a handle. She must be using it as a wand holder, he thought. She sighed. I suppose you're right. You haven't done anything to me, and you're a civilian, so I suppose I can't kill you or use magic, harpy form, or fireballs against you without authorization. Morny breathed a sigh of relief. I'm glad we agree. That's as far as he got before the Vila's arm lashed out and hit him on the head with the butt of an American-made gun. The Ciudadani man crumpled to the ground, and the Vila checked for a minute to make sure he wasn't seriously injured. Confirming that he was only knocked out, she obliviated him and moved on to rejoin her forces. The Nestorian attack on Círdan had begun. Chapter 444, Crotchety Very Old Men. Wednesday, November 27, 1996, Transfiguration Professor's Office, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizard, United Kingdom, Atlantis, DEFCON status. 337%. Next up. Those penguins make the one in Batman look good. Hugh DeLord had been afraid of this. When Armando Dippett's widow had called him and asked to speak with him, he suspected he knew what it would be about. He had always thought that his master's old policy of giving about 24 people the elixir of life had been a mistake. Granted, Doctor. Flamel had abandoned that practice back in the early 1970s when the first war against the Death Eaters had broken out, and by the time the original Philosopher's Stone had been destroyed in 1992, only the 2 Flamels and Hugh had still been using it. Flamel giving it to his wife made a lot of sense, and it was only fair that Hugh, who was Flamel's old apprentice, had did most of the work. Similar to a graduate student today, would get unlimited use of the stuff. Not many people had realized that Armando Dippet had been born in 1637, and that his wife Sophia had been born in 1640. Granted, everyone had assumed that Dumbledore's predecessor at Hogwarts had been old, maybe in his 80s or so. After all, Professor Dippet had had the appearance of a man in his 80s. They would have gone nuts, however, had they realized how old he actually was. And it would have only been a matter of time until a lot of people started looking suspiciously at Nicholas Flamel. Of the 25 people who had been given access to the elixir of life, Hugh suspected that 13 or 14 were still alive 20 years after their supply of elixir had been cut off. Hugh certainly knew about himself, Dr. Flamel, and Mrs. Flamel. Sophia Dippet was clearly still alive, so that made 4. Who else was still out there, miffed that Flamel had seen fit to restrict who got the elixir? Hoping that this interview wouldn't be a disaster, he told Mrs. Dippet to come into his office. Professor Dippet's widow proved to be a white-haired woman who had appeared to be in her late 90s and likely didn't have much longer to go. She walked with a cane, and her face was a mass of wrinkles. At her side was the Dippet's 320-year-old son, whom Armando had apparently been feeding the elixir, even though Flamel had cautioned him not to do that. Ernesto Dippet looked to be in his 60s or so, and could still walk unaided. Hugh had to bend down to address the frail old woman. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Dippet. How are you?" Sophia shrugged, and when she spoke her voice was hoarse. "I'm definitely getting old, Hugh. I don't know how much longer I have left. Losing my husband back in 1992 didn't help, to say the least." "That's understandable, Mrs. Dippet. If you wish, I can recommend some counselors for people who have recently lost their loved ones." Sophia spat a Spanish expletive at him. "I highly doubt that counselors will know what to do when the client is trying to deal with the end of a 323-year-long marriage. And who are you to judge? You never married and don't know what it's like." Hugh forced himself to remain calm. "On the contrary, my master and his wife have been together for almost twice that." Sophia cut him off. "And it's your master's fault that I'm in this predicament right now. His decision to stop giving out the elixir of life has freely cost me my health and eventually cost my husband his life. And now, to add insult to injury, Albus Dumbledore instructed him to destroy the stone just before Armando died." Hugh sat down and put his head in his hands. Finally, he looked back up at his two visitors. "I believe Dr. Flamel explained his reasoning. The powerful dark wizard Voldemort had just returned, a man well versed in the dark arts and probably the greatest threat to mankind since Boris Karsh. He had already tried to steal the Philosopher's Stone, going so far as to possess a Hogwarts professor to try to get at it. My master trusts Dumbledore's judgment. You should as well." Ernesto spoke in his deep voice. "Easy for you to say. You didn't lose your father because of that decision, or your master, for that matter." Hugh sighed. Voldemort was responsible for a judgment day. That alone should tell you how serious this was. Can you imagine what would have happened had that man actually gained access to immortality? Although Mrs. Flamel and I originally balked at the idea of him destroying the stone, Dumbledore appeared to have been spot on. Destroying the stone was the right decision, even though it was distasteful at the time. Mrs. Dippet looked at Hugh slyly. "I see. And now that Voldemort is dead, what is preventing you from recreating the stone?" Hugh hesitated for a moment. She hadn't been the first person to make that suggestion. Nevertheless, he had seen enough to answer the question. "Your request would have been reasonable had it not been for one thing." "Oh, and what's that?" "The fall of the Statute of Secrecy shortly before Voldemort's death. The danger now is not Voldemort getting the stone. It's the possibility of the Muggles getting the stone. Can you imagine what would happen to civilization if someone publicized the means to achieve eternal youth and health?" Sophia glared at him. "And how would the Muggles get the stone?" Hugh suppressed the urge to scream. "Apparently you haven't kept up with the news. Shortly after the Super Bowl breach, the Muggles found out about the stone and broke into my master's house to steal his diary, which contained complete instructions for building the stone. A Muggle pharmaceutical company then hired an alchemist to create a stone and start selling the elixir of life." Sophia stared at her son and then at Hugh. "Really? Which company is this? I should get in touch with them." Hugh bit his lip. "Don't bother, Mrs. Dippet. When my master found out about Harold Green's elixir program, he went up in flames. That, incidentally, was part of the reason Dumbledore had Dr. Flamel succeed him as Minister of Magic shortly after Judgment Day. Flamel worked together with the American authorities to confiscate the stones, as Harold Green created them. The crisis ended with one stone in the hands of the Pentagon, one in the hands of the American Department of Magic. and all copies of my master's diary destroyed so that Harold Green can't make any new copies from scratch. Sophia threw up her hands. Sounds rather hypocritical of him to try to keep the stone from the Muggles, considering that one of the stones wound up in the hands of the Muggle Defense Forces. I agree, Flamel didn't like that all that much. However, without an alchemist, and without the instructions, they're not going to be able to do much. Sophia stared at him hard. And what happens if they find an alchemist capable of reverse engineering the elixir? Then the elixir will leak out into the Muggle world again, even though your master supposedly doesn't want that. Hugh was finding it harder and harder to suppress his frustration. They're not going to be able to do it without at least some magical support. Besides, you have to understand that unless I'm very badly mistaken, the stone in the Pentagon has top-secret classification. No one is going to get access to it. At the very least, it's at a security level equivalent to that of the Death Gates and so forth in the Department of Mysteries. Trust me, Mrs. Dippet, nothing is going to come of this. The Muggles are not getting access to that stone. Sophia muttered to herself a little as Ernesto looked at him thoughtfully. Hugh, there could be another option. You said that you were Dr. Flamel's apprentice, right? You helped him with the stone. Hugh nodded. That's right. You did most of the work developing the stone, similar to a modern graduate student, and you got access to the elixir as a result. Ernesto grinned. Good. Where are your notes from your apprenticeship days? The notes whose results you dictated to Flamel back in the 1300s. Hugh swore he was afraid someone would figure out he still had them. Under lock, key, and several powerful enchantments. Yes, I've got another copy of the instructions, and they're not coming out unless someone gives me a very good reason. And I mean a very good reason. Ernesto pointed to his mother. How about saving her life? Like she said, she doesn't have much longer at the rate things are going. Hugh fumed. Much as I feel for you, I cannot let one person's feelings dictate how I will handle what could very well be one of the most dangerous inventions in the history of the human race. Sophia hissed at him. Your master killed my husband, Hugh. I demand compensation. He did not kill your husband, Mrs. Dippet. He realized that the human race is not yet deserving of immortality. Oh, really? Who are you to say that immortality is immoral while you yourself were on the stone? And how can you say that Dr. Flamel did not kill my husband? By destroying that stone, he sentenced my husband, me, and my son to death. An undeserving death, I might add, considering my husband's contribution to the Spanish and British educational institutions. You too should be happy you're still alive. Had Dr. Flamel not respected your work, he would not have given you the elixir, and you would have passed on in the 18th century. As it is, even I will pass on in maybe 40 or 50 years. Sophia laughed evilly. Why do I doubt that, when you're my age? I'm already older than you are. Physically, I mean that stone is going to come out again. You're going to regret not having been on the stone the whole time. You're probably going to Fidelius the stone to yourself, so no one else can use it, and then live on forever, afraid of death. Hugh blinked. Fidelius the stone to himself once Flamel and his wife pass on and not tell anyone. He hadn't thought of that. Ernesto turned to his mother. Mother, do you think we should talk to the Pentagon and offer them our services in reconstructing the elixir? Hugh started to lose his temper. It's not going to work. You're not alchemists. You likely won't get through the security checkpoints, and they can probably get alchemists from somewhere else. Sophia Dippet unleashed a long string of Spanish expletives. This was a waste of time, Ernesto. Here, help me up so I can get on with what's left of my life, however little that may be. Hugh waved Ernesto aside and helped Mrs. Dippet up. He was the host, after all, and proprieties needed to be observed. Gently, he said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Dippet, but I have no choice. I'm sentencing myself, as well as everyone else I know, to death. But when the alternative is possibly the collapse of civilization. Mrs. Dippet, you are currently the fourth oldest person in the world. You must have gained a lot of wisdom over the years. If you think this over, you'll have to understand that this must be done. The Dippets said nothing as Ernesto helped his mother to the door. As they were about to leave, Mrs. Dippet turned back to Hugh. Methuselah lived for 969 years, and I am barely a third of the way through that. Rest assured, Hugh, the stone will rise again. Given Harold Green's work and the alchemists out there, it is only a matter of time. And when it does reappear, whoever brings it out will earn the complete support of myself and quite possibly the Spanish Ministry of Magic. Until then, adios. And with that, she put on her wimple and made her way out of the office, leaving behind a very troubled and thoughtful Hugh DeLorean. Chapter 445. Círdan V's Nestor escalates. 5155, a Gold Earthling joined. Feb 11, 2007 location. Brookline, Mopdate 445. Those penguins make the one in Batman look good. Wednesday, November 27, 1996, Executive Council Chamber Sidashiadan Atlantis, DEFCON status. 339% next up. I didn't know they had mermaid Vila. Supreme Chancellor Vixar couldn't believe what he was hearing. What? Are you sure about this? The Defense Minister nodded. Yes, sir. There are reports of thousands of Vila arriving on the southeast coast. A good 30 miles of coastline have already been enthralled, for the lack of a better word. Ortilu groaned. That's not good. What have you been doing about it so far? The Defense Minister sat down and put his head in his hands. This is going to be tricky, Chancellors. This is effectively a two-front war at this point, because we've got to deal with the Yahoo resistance movement as well. The SMRM is starting to make inroads in the southwestern parts of the island, and the rebellion has just gotten worse since Nestor invaded. I have a strong suspicion that the Nestorians are backing SMRM and are taking advantage of the Yahoo rebellion to invade. Sayatnan growled at him. Answer the question, Defense Minister. What are we doing to fix this problem? The Defense Minister sighed. We've segregated our forces by gender and sent all of the women over to deal with the Vila. The women naturally won't be susceptible to the Vila's charm, and if we're lucky, we'll be able to infiltrate their ranks. The men will stay behind dealing with SMRM. Vixar shrugged. I suppose that's the best we can do, Defense Minister. Do you think it will be enough? I'm not sure, sir, for 3 reasons. First, Markali has thrown a platoon of witches into the invading forces, so our forces will have magic to deal with as well as Vila. For another, we have reason to believe there will be male Nestorians in the invading army as well. All 3 chancellors gasped. Men, that's impossible. The Defense Minister shook his head sadly. Unfortunately, it is in fact possible. Although we all know it's impossible to have a pure male Vila, you can have half Vila men with a Vila mother and a human father. These men won't be able to turn into harpies or shoot fireballs at us. However, they still have the ability to charm people of the opposing gender. Sayatnan got it immediately. Shit. They knew we'd send women, so they send men out in the vanguard of the army to turn all of our units into quivering masses of drooling meat. The regular units then come up behind us and smash us. Exactly, ma'am. If I were Markali, I'd send the men in stark naked so they'll be able to impress us the most. Ortilu shook her head. I don't see how they can do that, Defense Minister. Won't the Nestorian men distract their own troops and vice versa? I'm afraid not, ma'am. We have picked up intelligence that the Nestorian units are wearing blindfolds which will protect them against their colleagues' charms. Will be affected, and they will not. Sayatnan grated. Can we use the Akio spell to steal their blindfolds and have them flirt with each other while we mop them up? We've almost certainly got more wizards than they do. The Defense Minister's eyes widened. That may not be a bad idea, ma'am. I'll see that the order gets passed down the chain of command. However, back to the subject at hand, our third complication. Oh, and what's that? The Defense Minister paused for a moment, then groaned. We have reason to believe that several of these women have been armed with Muggle projectile weapons in addition to their wands. Sayatnan swore, "The United States is getting involved." The defense minister nodded. "That's a distinct possibility, ma'am. Needless to say that if the Muggle world gets involved, this could escalate very rapidly. Atlantis claims that we've been hovering at DEFCON 3 for a while now. If this becomes a major Muggle wizarding war, with the Judgment Day deterrent out of use until June 2001. Vixar cut in. "The American president can't be stupid enough to escalate this, particularly after the reforms we've already introduced. Clinton may have no choice. The ordinary citizens of the United States have been turned against us, albeit in error, by Altry's refugees. If he's a good leader, he'll have to obey the requests of his people." Sayatnan threw her hands up. "Defense Minister, do you have any good news at least?" The defense minister's mood brightened somewhat. "The initial Nestorian advance has been blunted, and for the time being we've been holding our own. We'll need more assistance to push them back into the sea again." Sayatnan turned to face Vixar. "I think it's time to call upon Salasia and the Order of the Great Bear. Thank the five gods for that alliance." Vixar winced. "Salasia, fine. However, I'm still somewhat reluctant to bring Zyganov and his movement into it. After all, he's associated with Kashe. I know Zyganov promised us that we'd take over Nestor. However, right now we're on the defensive. I don't think we're in a position to benefit from Zyganov's help yet. We need more men. Well, women." "What about the merpeople?" The defense minister scratched his chin. "You know, that might not be a bad idea. Nestor is an island, which means the merpeople can get at it from all sides underwater. Imagine an amphibious assault on the entire coast. I like it, to be honest. As long as civilians are off limits, I'd be up for that." Sayatnan grunted. "Civilians are off limits." "Yes, ma'am. The Nestorian forces have been decent enough to not attack any of our civilians, so we will do the same. The only way the civilians will get in the way here would possibly be in the form of charmed collaborators, in which case they are not to be harmed, because it was not their fault." Ortilu looked out the window, thought for a moment, then turned slowly back to the defense minister. "We have reason to believe that we may be able to launch a mission to assassinate President Clinton and have the Vila blamed for it. What's your opinion of that?" The defense minister shook his head vehemently. "Absolutely not. They will almost certainly retaliate in kind and knock out one, or possibly all three of you. And remember the law: once one of you dies, the other two have to resign, and elections for 3 new chancellors have to be held within 2 months. Trust me, chancellors, we don't want to have a vacancy at the top during a war." Sayatnan looked at him like he was stupid. "They're Americans. They can't get to us with the protector up." The defense minister glared at her. "So they tell the Vila to do it for them. Big deal. Trust me, we're not taking the risk. And speaking of the protector, if I were you, I'd start deploying forces to guard the protector. If the United States wants to invade us directly, they'd have the Vila come over and do to us what 2 exceeds 4 did to Houyanghamland." All eyes turned to Vixar. As the Supreme Chancellor, he had the final say. Vixar drew a deep breath. "May the 5 gods help us all. All right, here's what we will do. We'll call over the Tsalal ambassador and formally request military support from those trained penguins down there. Once we're done with her, get in touch with the merpeople and see what they can do to harass Nestor. Instruct them to use female troops only. Hopefully, this will force them to pull some soldiers out of here to deal with the defense of their home island. Defense Minister, warn our troops there may be men in the invading army which could distract our women. And while you're there, start thinking of ways to mass-produce those blindfolds. Finally, start telling everyone that Tsalal help may be on the way. That will improve our morale and make Clinton start thinking twice about getting involved here." Atlantis, Dagher swore when he saw the report. "This is not good. We do not want that mess in the Atlantic escalating further." Endukaku raised his hands in resignation. Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do about that right now. We're still at DEFCON 3 after all. What's the current number? Endukaku bit his lip. 3.9%. It's gone up 0.2% in the past few hours. In case you're wondering, that's over a 5% increase. Keep an eye on that number, head astrologer. I'm going to start making plans, and when that thing hits 5, we're going to DEFCON 2, and we're going to nail those troublemakers. I now what? Endukaku spun and saw that an urgent memo had hit the Grand Mugwump in the head and was trying to peck a hole in his forehead like a little bird. Muttering to himself, the Grand Mugwump unfolded the paper and looked at it. His eyes widened even further. He swore and handed the document to Endukaku. Give this to Dialanis. I can't deal with it right now. Endukaku read the memo and whistled. A Holocaust survivor is suing us for not saving the Jews, Gypsies, and other ethnic groups from the Nazis, and obliviating the Holocaust victims to cover up the statute of secrecy. That's what it says. Get Dialanis if he likes interacting with Muggles. Now's the perfect opportunity. Do it. Now. Chapter 446. Mordor calls for aid. Wednesday, November 27, 1996. Executive Council Chamber Siadashiadan. The chamber's engraved marble gate swung open as Raisa, newly minted Lord of the Ramas, formerly a sleepy fishing town in northeast Círdan, current site of some impressive amphibious construction projects, liege lord of the Trapanandan political refugees, also known as traitorous Death Eater scum, recently rechristened the Ramians, and bannerman of the Wizards' Republic of Círdan, marched in and bowed deeply and ceremoniously before the three cancellors. You called for me, my lord and ladies. You may rise, Merwizard. You were summoned here for an urgent reason, began Vixar, one that you may not be aware of yet. Forces of Nestor have invaded our southeast coast. The amphibious spellcaster immediately responded. Our wands are yours to command, my lord. Where shall we attack? Pleased by the vassal's eagerness, Vixar smirked. Don't be so hasty, good Racer. First of all, we'd like to ask you for advice. Read the reports. Share your insight if you have any. Reading through the parchments, the ex-Strapanandan's head was filled with ideas. Finally, as he put it down, he exhaled deeply and presented his analysis of the situation. Your southern provinces are in serious trouble. That much is obvious. I suggest a total evacuation in the affected areas and a few dozen miles wide buffer zone, as much as you can spare without your wartime economy collapsing. Then, my men and any Ciudadani willing and capable to do some serious collateral damage will swoop in from the air, unleashing area effect curses to kill everything on the ground from beyond charm range. In my experience, airborne Vila tend to come in their hoppy form instead of on brooms. That way they can use their fireballs and nonverbal wand magic if they have it, and have more firepower than a human or merpeople caster could lay down. However, for all their destructive potential, they are just birds with meager active gravity or inertia manipulation powers. In other words, they'd be outmaneuvered and massacred in a dogfight by even a smaller group of wizards on brooms. Interesting, mused Sayatnan. Do you have any personal experience fighting these beasts, or this is just book knowledge? Racer then proceeded to tell her about the skirmishes in and over Howihamland he and his army fought in, against Vila flyers among others. Granted, they were not military-trained Nestorians as far as I know, but their limitations appeared to be anatomical in nature, and thus still valid, he concluded. Now wait just a minute, snapped the Lady Chancellor. You propose we use the same spells you unleashed on Hinhinham. Thousands died there in less than a minute, and several times as many in the following days, till the last fire was put out, the last poison gas cloud was dispelled, the last movement-seeking animated metal tentacle monster was exhausted. That's hardly the complete list of it, Chancellor. But as I said, it'd only be deployed after an evacuation. We'd only destroy the Vila and those already enthralled by them, along with some architecture. Consider this, my lady Cyathnan. Would you rather have something go up in flame or left at the mercy of Nestor? Well, call it Plan C, as in, completely out of other options, said Vixar. I'd rather avoid destroying our land to save it, not to mention the political ramifications of some influential outsiders becoming collateral damage if they wander by. How did we deal with the Vila last time we went to war? There is surprisingly little accurate data on that. Invisible Witch imperiuses the Vila and orders it to order its thralls to kill all Vila in the vicinity, replied the so far silent Ortilu. Results are a load of dead Vila, and even more emotionally scarred wizards, many of whom have taken their lives with their own hands. And now the witches aren't a safe way any longer if they truly send their men too. We go with those plans, we're screwed either way. Perhaps we should try to negotiate a peace. Merlin's withered unmentionables, Ortilu, cease your defeatist gibbering, shouted Vixar. We have not considered an obvious option yet. Let's use the merpeople spells, but not on our land. It is the Vila who attacked us, why not bring the war over to their island? Let's call back that minister. Tell him to organize hit-and-run, airborne raiding parties to plunder Nestor. Let's. He was briefly interrupted by a patroness materializing before Raesar and passing over a quick message, but seeing how the merwizard's face brightened up, he wasn't angry, just curious. What news, merwizard? Raesar, with a smile showing a bit too many teeth by human standards, let out a chuckle that sent shivers up the human spine. My subordinates just contacted me. After only a few casualties, they managed to revert one of us into our true form. Cancellors, I suggest we send some amphibious surprise, along with those airborne raiding parties. Vixar, too, let loose an evil laugh. Yes, that's how I like it. Now listen to me, I have this idea. Thursday, November 28, 1996, cast a Serena cruise ship between Cape Verde and Nestor Atlantis DEFCON status. 345% next up. It's better than animated turkey bowl Roman 12 Plinio. Raoul Henriques couldn't believe that he was getting another chance to go through the Protector and visit Nestor again. Winning the lottery for a night of adult revelry had been one thing. This time, however, things would be different. The woman he had dallied with in Nestor had reported that she had gotten pregnant unexpectedly. After a brief discussion, the couple had agreed to keep the baby and raise the child as a Nestorian half-Vila, or full Vila, in case it was a girl. As was usually the case, the father would get full visitation rights now that the statute of secrecy had come down. The only thing that Henriques had requested would be for the child to be baptized as well as be raised to honor the 5 gods. He wasn't the only person on the ship, of course. Nestor had held another lottery about a month earlier, this time for a different town about to enter mating season. The winners had been announced last week, and a brand new group of horny 20-somethings were now en route to the island. Henriques tried to explain to them what exactly would be awaiting them, but all that managed to do was get them even more excited. Henriques would have submitted his name once again, only to find that people who had won the lottery were not eligible to participate for the next 3 years. He soon realized, however, that he didn't want more accidents to occur and find that he had fathered a whole town in a few years. Gabrielle had told him that she would be showing him around her town and trying to point out places which would be important in the raising of their child. The local 5 Guards church, the school, recreational activities, communal child care facilities, and so forth. He would be one of the first Muggles to actually see this part of the island. She recommended that she bring Muggle recording devices in case he wanted to document any of this information. The cruise ship was opulent, of course. In fact, it was even more opulent than he remembered. He had a strong suspicion that the Nestorian Public Relations Committee had decked it out with magical spells to make it look fancier, and at the very least, get it through the Protector more efficiently. How else could there be smokeless candles hanging from the ceiling in the hallways without anything obviously holding them up? The public address system announced that they were about 1 day from Nestor. There was no way for Henriques to tell, of course, as there weren't any land masses anywhere in sight. As far as he knew, Nestor was right over the horizon, if he would be able to see it at all outside the protector. Figuring it was time to relax in the sauna again, he turned away from the railing and headed back inside. He was just about to open the door to the interior of the ship when someone shouted, "Merpeople!" Henriques spun and saw someone pointing frantically at the water. Merpeople. Had someone mentioned merpeople? He hadn't seen any merpeople near Nestor last time. He hurried back over to the railing and found himself in the middle of a large group of camera-toting, pointing passengers. He looked in the direction they were pointing and saw an amazing sight. No fewer than 15 humanoid figures swimming alongside them. He brought out his camera and took a few shots. He didn't know how they were doing it, but the merpeople were probably doing a good 30 knots to keep up with the ship. Henriques was a little worried. He didn't know if merpeople shared the same facial expressions as ordinary humans like himself. If they did, he would have thought that they looked very serious and were planning to board the ship. That made no sense, however. There hadn't been a merman boarding party last time he had gone to Nestor. He looked beyond the merpeople, back towards the horizon, and saw much to his surprise that the waves weren't going by that quickly anymore. Was it his imagination, or was the ship slowing down? Maybe they were going to be boarding the ship after all. It would certainly explain why the merpeople had been able to keep up with the vessel. Ignoring the comments of the other passengers claiming that the merpeople were Vila pets, he hurried over to the bow of the ship to see if there was an obstacle in their path. As it turned out, there was a good reason the ship was slowing down. A good 100 merpeople were spread out in front of them, several of whom were riding some kind of strange aquatic animal. There were dolphins in the area as well who were staring at the vessel with little beady eyes. People here were screaming and waving at the merpeople, but they either didn't listen or ignored them. 3 of them were holding up a scroll with a huge sign on it. It was in Latin, and Henriques had to go back to his Catholic school days to try to translate the words. He didn't get all of them, but he got enough of them to figure out the gist of what they were saying. Attention, Muggle vessel. We are from the Nautical Division of the Nestorian Customs Department. Stop and prepare to be boarded. Please declare any Muggle technology and weapons. Henriques's frown deepened. This didn't make sense. He'd been to Nestor before, and the customs check had been done by Vila on the island itself. Why would they be doing it out here with such urgency and use merpeople instead of Vila? Was someone smuggling weapons into Nestor on cruise ships? That was the only thing that it could be, he concluded. The only way for Muggle weapons to make it to Nestor would be to get Muggles over there, and the Muggles couldn't get through the protector without using cruise ships. The cruise ship slowed ponderously to a halt. By the time it had stopped, a good 20% of the passengers and some of the crew were on deck taking photographs of the merpeople and asking them to pose for the passengers. The merpeople, however, weren't cooperating. They were all business and didn't look like they knew how to smile. The public address system came on as some of the merpeople disappeared below the railing where Henriques couldn't see them. Attention, please. This is the captain speaking. We have just been contacted by the Nestorian Customs Agency. They will be doing a brief inspection here at sea to make sure that we are not bringing in any Muggle weapons or other objects which do not belong in Nestorian territory. Please return to your staterooms and bring out all of your suitcases. Hopefully, we will be on our way within a couple of hours. They will be going room to room checking on each person's belongings. Note that they have difficulty speaking outside of the water, so you will have to communicate with them using the written word and sign language. They seem to be most familiar with Latin, though they seem to know bits and pieces of English. While they are on board, treat them like guests and the important public officials that they are. Yes, most of us haven't seen them before. I certainly haven't, as this seems to be a new process, but keep in mind that they would likely be offended if we started treating them as tourist attractions. That is all, ladies and gentlemen. I will report when we're about to get going again. The guests made their way back towards their staterooms in a somewhat orderly mob, and it took Henriques a good 5 minutes to get back to his room. He looked at his roommate, who was already pulling his bags out of the closet near the entrance. The roommate looked at him in excitement. Wow, merpeople! Did you know they existed? Plinio, what's wrong? Henriques's face was grim. I've been to Nestor before, and this didn't happen last time. Something fishy is going on here, no pun intended. I went to Catholic school, and from what I saw on the sign at the front of the ship, they're going to be checking for Muggle technology and possibly weapons. The roommate frowned. They're confiscating Muggle technology. Why would they do that? I'm not sure. Keep your eyes open. Something really doesn't smell right here. It took a good 2 hours for the customs agent to reach their stateroom. Finally, Henriques heard a knock on the door and saw a piece of parchment slid underneath it. Henriques picked it up and saw that it was written in both Latin and bad English. This is Agent Racer of the Nestorian Customs Agency. Please let us in so we can inspect your belongings. We apologize for the inconvenience. Henriques opened the door and moved out of the way as two people entered the room, followed by one in with a few medals on his chest. Very interesting, Henriques thought. We got some bigwig here. Racer and his buddies made their way into the room and started looking through the suitcases. Eventually, one of them let out a hideous noise and brought out Henriques's Swiss Army knife. Racer's eyes narrowed, and he started writing frantically on a sheet of paper. Whose bag is this? Henriques raised his hand, and the two merman flunkies began pointing tridents at him. Oh, wonderful, he thought. Racer continued. I'm afraid we will have to confiscate this until you leave. Are you going to be returning on this ship as well? Henriques shook his head. You will be on Nestor for a while. Henriques nodded. How long will you be here? Henriques grabbed a notepad and wrote down, a week or so. Racer's eyes narrowed further. That is a long time. What is the purpose of your visit? I came over earlier as a breeding lottery winner. The woman's name was Gabrielle, and apparently she didn't realize that it was the wrong time of the month for her to be having unprotected sex. I'm going over there now so we can discuss how exactly we're going to be raising the child. The other two merpeople laughed at this, and even the stern Racer chuckled. Now this makes sense. I doubt you'll be the last man to find himself in this predicament. I hope you don't mind having about 15 stepchildren, sir. Henriques blushed as Racer showed him the Swiss Army knife and gave him a piece of official-looking parchment. Take this document. When you leave, give it to the customs agent, and you can get your weapon back. Be advised that Nestor has recently initiated an aggressive war with the peaceful state of Círdan. If you see soldiers around, stay out of their way. Henriques gulped. War? What war? The merman flunkies made their way out of the room. Bowing politely to Henriques and his roommate, Racer left the room and shut the door behind him. There was a brief moment of silence. Finally, the roommate turned to him. You knocked up a villa here when you visited last time. Henriques sat down, embarrassed. Yes, neither of us expected it, and I get visitation rights once the child is born. The roommate started chattering excitedly. All right, what was it like? Ha, tell me. Henriques looked thoughtfully at the door to the stateroom. Something does not seem right here. He mentioned a war between Nestor and Círdan, wherever that is. There was no such war going on during my last visit. And I can already tell you that, when I went through customs last time in Nestor, it was done on the island itself, and they didn't take the Swiss Army knife. Maybe it's this war the merman was talking about. Possibly. Perhaps they're concerned that people from this Círdan will get their hands on the weapons if this Círdan really exists. Whatever it is, be careful. I've got a bad feeling about this. Nestora Markali looked at her customs minister in astonishment. What do you mean? The Serena got boarded by customs agents a day away from here. The customs minister nodded. The captain just sent back one of the emergency albatrosses with a message. Apparently they've been boarded by a large group of merpeople and searched for weapons. Markali fumed. That can't be right. We do our custom search here on the island. Did you change the policies without telling me? No, ma'am. If someone searched the boat, it was not us. And rest assured, to the best of my knowledge, we don't employ merpeople. What's your interpretation this, customs minister? The customs minister hesitated a bit before speaking. I don't know if it's just me, but it sounds a lot like Círdan is trying to put up a blockade and is using merpeople to enforce it. Blockade? How can they put up a blockade if we can just fly over the merpeople's heads? They must have discovered the American weapons on our soldiers and planned a counterattack. They're probably trying to get their hands on Muggle weapons, either to deprive us from them or even the score. Since we still have the Protector up, there are only two ways for Muggle weapons to get over here. First, have the American government smuggle us some through Ariadne, which is the way we got our first shipment. Second, have Muggle civilians bring them over on cruise ships, as they've done the 5 times since. Markali swore. The Círdan have allied with the merpeople and are trying to use the American Muggle weapons against us. What did Rattle's ambassador say about this? The customs minister groaned. She was outraged and admitted under Veritaserum that she knows nothing about this. Markali swore more vehemently. Oh, wonderful. A bunch of merpeople have gone rogue and sided with Círdan, and unless I'm badly mistaken, Salasia as well. The customs minister winced. The penguins are involved too. It looks like it. My guess, however, is that the Tsal's dispute is more with the United States than with us. The Tsalal ambassador has told us that the penguin troops are under orders not to attack Nestorian forces unless it's in self-defense. The customs minister wilted. Good Lord, 3 against 2, and our ally can't help very well with the Protector in the way. Exactly. This leaves us with 2 choices. Drop the Protector or ask the United States to start sending more and more materiel over. We can't drop the Protector on a moment's notice because it will cause serious climatic problems. From what I've been told, deactivating the Protector properly will cause the island to reappear in a span of 18 to 24 months. The customs minister nodded. I've heard that too. Markali continued. This means our only option is to increase American involvement in this war. I'm going to tell Clinton that we're going to need many more supplies, and we can't rely on cruise ships to get them through. The customs minister whistled. This could escalate the war. If Clinton starts sending more materiel over, this run-of-the-cauldron fight with Círdan could drag in Salasia and turn into a world war because of all of these alliances. Rattle could have a civil war, for all we know. Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't think we should get the us involved. From what I've read about Muggle history, this reminds me a lot of the way the Europe was set up in 1914. And our attack on southeastern Círdan could have been the equivalent of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Markali shook her head. It can't be all that bad. However, in this case we have no choice. If Círdan has gotten its hands on Muggle weapons which were meant to come to us, we'll need more Muggle weapons to counter that. We need the us, I'm afraid. Right now, it's effectively 3-on-1, and the other guys are working of setting up a blockade. We have no choice. Tell the us to get out of there, and hope that Salasia will go away. Once the us leaves, it becomes a wizarding-only war. All right, that leaves us 2-on-1, with the bad guys having Muggle weapons and a possible blockade while we don't. The customs minister was about to respond when someone rushed in with a report. Ma'am, we've got reports all around the island of increased merperson activity. There have been hundreds of sightings of merpeople. Markali spun. What's going on? Are they doing anything to us? No, ma'am. They're just watching for now. However, they've got some strange spider-like machines in the area with them. Markali looked at the customs minister helplessly before responding. Take the next 2 groups of soldiers destined for Círdan and deploy them around the island to face off against the merpeople. They are only to attack in self-defense. Do you hear me? Self-defense only. The visitor nodded and ran off. Markali muttered to herself, "How many troops do these rogue merpeople have?" The customs minister sighed. "I don't know, ma'am. We need us all the more so now. I'm going to talk to him and start making formal requests for assistance. Yes, it may expand the war, but we have no choice. In the meantime, I think it's time for us to reinstitute the draft." The customs minister shook her head. "I don't like it, ma'am." "I don't like it either, customs minister." Chapter 447, Quadpart Halftime Show. Thursday, November 28, 1,996,169, South Street, Waltham, United States of America. Atlantis DEFCON status. 345% finally, a day off. With all of the days I'd have to use for the Jewish holidays and an occasional forced workday on Sunday, it was good to have a vacation at last. Besides, even if I had gone in, there wouldn't have been anyone there to tell me what to do, so I would have been bored to tears. I had been forwarded an interesting email from my mother, who has always had a notorious tendency to forward corny jokes which were the most part not particularly funny. This message, however, actually had some substance to it. On this Thanksgiving Day, consider the following if you find it difficult to find things to be thankful for. Remember that on June 20th, the world as you knew it came very close to ending in radioactive fire. The fact that you are alive today is, in one sense, a combination of the power of the wizards and the simple fact that you were not in the wrong place at the wrong time. Had those bombs gone off in your hometown instead of New York, Ogdensburg, or Miami, you would not be here to receive this message. Regardless of where you live or where you came from, you have something to thankful for, and you would be well served to remember this. Whoever had initiated this email thread did in fact have a point, especially for people in Boston. Had Kurchatova, I still couldn't believe that she was a witch after all these years, and her magical friends not summoned a rainstorm to beat down that cloud of nuclear fallout heading northeast from the ruins of New York. Boston could have very well suffered some serious casualties from the radiation. As a matter of fact, Thomas Menino had organized a small ceremony downtown to remind Bostonians how close the city had come to suffering radiation poisoning. Supposedly, he had managed to convince Kurchatova herself to give a little speech explaining what she and her colleagues had done. Considering that she was already a national hero and a well-known witch, it was almost certain that the speech would draw huge crowds. No one could have predicted at the beginning of the year that wizards would appear among us. Once that had happened, however, there were plenty of ways which our lives could have been ruined, yet we somehow managed to outlast them all. As the Passover prayer day knew goes, many things had gone right, and dodging a large number of those bullets, only to be struck by one later on, would have been more than enough to be satisfied with. Had the wizards been prevented from taking over the world, yet the Quabbin had still been contaminated, that would have been enough for us. Had God Fate restored the water of the Quabbin, but not prevented catastrophe in Cambridge, that would have been enough for us. Had God Fate prevented catastrophe in Cambridge, but allowed Voldemort to take over the world, that would have been enough for us. Had God Fate prevented Voldemort from taking over the world, but allowed Boston to be hit with radioactive fallout, that would have been enough for us. Had God Fate prevented Boston from being hit with radioactive fallout, yet caused me to lose my new job as a software engineer at Parametric, that would have been enough for us. The list went on and on. I personally had suffered several hardships, to be certain: a forced evacuation to Curacao, a water shortage, a pay cut, a threat to my job, and so forth. Yet I was still alive, and I had to admit that was the most important thing of all. Some things didn't change, however. As usual, our family had been invited to the Babchuck's house for Thanksgiving dinner, and my mother was screaming at me that I shouldn't come in blue jeans. There was a bit of a problem in that this conflicted with another tradition on Thanksgiving Day, which started before the trip to the Babchucks. watching the various Thanksgiving Day football games. The current game had the Chiefs playing the Lions, and the later game had the Redskins playing the Cowboys. I never really understood why the Lions and Cowboys always had to play on Thanksgiving. Had it ever occurred to someone to have the Lions and Cowboys play each other on Thanksgiving? What inevitably tended to happen is that the Babchuck's two sons and I would inevitably spend most of the time in the TV room, while most of the people of my parents' generation made small talk in the living room. As an introvert, I couldn't handle having too many people around, and in some cases the presence of the people in the living room proved to be distracting. I would probably have to go out into the living room from time to talk a little to the other guests, and to grab hot dogs before my father ate them all. Making sure that I looked somewhat presentable, I hopped into the car and made my way over to the Babchucks with about 9 minutes left in the second quarter. As I turned the television off, the announcer noticed that there would be a special event occurring during the halftime show of the first game. It probably had something to do with betting, as the announcer was constantly mentioning a quad pot. I was a bit surprised that they'd be having live gambling during Thanksgiving, but what would I know about this? By the time I had made it over to the Babchucks, it was just about halftime. After making the cursory small talk with the hosts and a few of the other guests, of whom I only knew about a third, I made my way into the television room where the other people were watching the game. I got into the room just as the first half had come to a close. Wondering what form of gambling was going to take place, I glanced at the television set and saw something remarkable: a large forest of brooms making their way out into the field. Underneath the goalposts at opposite ends of the field were two huge pots filled with an amber liquid. I frowned and turned to the two boys. "What's this? Some kind of wizarding ceremony?" The elder boy watched the TV intently. "I think it's a wizarding sport. They're going to be demonstrating a wizarding sport during halftime. They're going to be betting on this sport. 4 parts. Sounds a bit odd for daytime TV, doesn't it?" The boy shook his head. "There's no gambling involved. The sport is called quadpot, QODPOT. It's the most popular wizarding sport in the United States." I gaped at him. The wizards have invented their own sports. They don't play baseball and stuff like the rest of us. I doubt it. Who'd have taught them if they don't interact with Muggles? Or at least didn't before the statute of secrecy fell. Now I was intrigued. I watched as a man in a fancy robe made his way out to midfield. He was accompanied by a man in a plain white robe. The man in the plain robe pointed his wand at the man with fancy robe, and the man in the fancy robe began to speak. The man's voice carried without the need for a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, happy Thanksgiving to you. My name is Travis Radner, and I am the former Secretary of Magic here in the United States. I am now retired and occasionally serve as a consultant for the Department of Magic. With me here is Lucas McGee, the head of the American Quadpot League. It is our pleasure to host a quadpot match here between the MT, St. Helens Eruption, and the Big Thicket Swamp Rats. These are two of the teams of the American Quadpot League, or ACL. This league has 10 members and is dedicated to the playing quadpot with integrity and passion. This matchup pits the 912 Eruption against the 1110 Swamp Rats, with the Swamp Rats serving as the home team in this exhibition. Radner reached into a box and withdrew a large red ball. The rules of quadpot are straightforward. Think of a combination of musical chairs and basketball. Teams of 11 players on each side spend time flying around the stadium trying to drop this ball, called a quad, into the opponent's goal, those cauldrons near the goal lines. This is similar to ball games you have seen before. However, there is a catch. At random times during the game, the ball will vanish. Any player in possession of the ball at the time it vanishes will be eliminated. That player must leave the field while the remaining players make their way back to their starting positions and wait for the ball to reappear. Note that this match will be played with a few variations. First, In traditional quadpart, the ball explodes instead of vanishes. We are currently experimenting with a vanishing ball, which is safer for both the fans and the players. Second, the game ends in most cases when all players on one of the two sides have been eliminated, at which point the team with the most goals wins. Due to the fact that there is a time constraint here, however, the game will end after 15 minutes regardless of how many players are still on the field for both teams. My eyebrows shot up as I looked at the two boys. Cool game. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Both boys shook their heads. One of them said that it reminded him a bit of dodgeball. Whoever gets hit with the ball at the end is out. But dodgeball on brooms, forget it. We watched the TV as Radner introduced the two teams. He then yielded the stage to Magee, who told the two captains to shake hands and moved out of the way to start the play-by-play. And they're off. Flynn has the quad for the swamp rats. He passes it to Michaels, who passes it back to Flynn. Douglas gets in the way, but Flynn swerves around him. He's heading for the goal and the ball vanishes. Too bad, swamp rats. Flynn is out. I watched as a furious Flynn made his way off the field to his bench. Meanwhile, at other side, a volcanic eruption blasted its way into the sky. That's not a real eruption, people. It's the eruption's way of celebrating something good happening to their team. The two sides made their way back to the center of the stadium and play resumed. This time, the eruption player threw the quad out of bounds. That's a foul, ladies and gentlemen. Grounds for a turnover. The eruption regained control of the ball and hurried towards the goal. Even an opposing power play couldn't prevent Jones from making his way around the goalie, and the swamp rat midfielder swooped in and dropped the ball in the goal. A huge shower of sparks burst out of the bowl as Magee screamed. Jones scores. 1-0 Swamp Rats. 13:25 left in the game. The game looked pretty interesting, I thought. I had a strange feeling that people would start playing this in various high schools and colleges over the next few years. People would run with the ball instead of fly with it, of course, and the disappearing ball could be replaced with something which buzzed every minute or so on the average. It was certainly fast-paced. As far as I could tell, there weren't any timeouts other than when the ball disappeared and players were eliminated. Finally, after 15 minutes, Magee called it a game. The final score was 4-3 Swamp Rats, and 3 players had been eliminated from both sides. The Cauldrons and Quadpot players were ushered off the field, giving some high school bands a chance to perform. Finally, the field was cleared once again, and the third quarter began. The elder Babchuck chuckled. Newton South is going to have 5x5 versions of this game in the basketball court within a few weeks. Mark my words. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if they take an 11x11 version onto the football field. I nodded. Neither would I highly doubt my high school will get as far as football, however. After all, we don't even have an ordinary football team. Atlantis. Sorcerer Pereira pulled over Endukaku. All right, I've done the calculations. We're stable at 4.5%. That's high DEFCON 3. Although most of the potential problems are still centered in and around the Black Sea, we're getting pretty concerned about what's happening in the Atlantic. If the United States' Muggle forces get dragged into this fight between those two hotheads, this will escalate in a hurry, and the whole world could go up in flames. We do not want the Muggles and wizards getting into a fight, and this time we don't have Judgment Day to fall back on. Endukaku looked at Pereira's report and nodded. Believe me, Pereira, I know, I don't like it either. Pereira hesitated. Head astrologer, I think there's something you may need to know. It's kind of a crazy idea, but I think it will solve a lot of our problems. And it would explain why the apocalypsometer isn't even higher. The prophecies have taken this into account. Endukaku turned to him, and that is. Pereira's voice came out in a whisper. There are a lot of people here in Atlantis which wouldn't mind if the statute of secrecy can be resealed and the damage caused by the Super Bowl breach somewhat undone. I know it's difficult, and it would likely need full Atlantis cooperation. If we get to DEFCON 1, or worse yet, break the 30% barrier, once more we may want to consider that as an option. Endukaku didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, the head astrologer's shoulders slumped as he said quietly, "You're not the first to think that. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any way to get the genie back in the bottle here. This isn't the 14th century anymore. Word travels fast nowadays, and as you saw from the Super Bowl breach, even wizards can't plug everything that quickly anymore. Surely there must be something you and Dagher can do." Endukaku shook his head. "I'm afraid it's impossible, at least according to current technology. Researching that will likely take years, and if that fight between Círdan and Nestor escalates, it will do so in much less than a year. However, I don't want to give up completely. We can have Dialynis or someone add it to the Millennium Problems list as a last resort in case everything goes haywire, and we don't have Judgment Day to fall back on." Pereira nodded. "Thank you, head astrologer. Let's hope we don't have to use it." "Agreed, Sorcerer Pereira. Now how about recomputing that percentage again? With our luck, it will hit 5 next time you try it, and I'll have to barge over to Dagger's office so we can declare DEFCON 2 and activate the Atlantis rings." Chapter 448. Joe, Hermione missed the climax. Friday, November 28, 1996, Gryffindor Common Room Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizard United Kingdom Atlantis, DEFCON status. 345% next up. It's the Isaac Sanders show. "I really need to get one of these quick quotes quills," thought J.K. Rowling. Realizing that Hermione would be giving many interviews over the next few years, including a few with Rowling, Professor Dumbledore, which one was that again, had convinced Headmaster Flitwick to get Hermione a magical device which would record anything spoken in its presence. It was an automatic dictating machine, so to speak, which transmitted spoken words directly to paper. Hermione had been forced to tinker with it at the beginning, as it had come with a tendency to try to embellish the stories and make them far more interesting than they were. Whereas those would work for sensational movie reviews and so forth, that wouldn't do for a factual documentary. From a Muggle perspective, virtually everything Hermione had discussed up to this point sounded like it would have come out of a fantasy television show or movie. The Philosopher's Stone, the existence of which had been leaked out into the world as Rowling knew it. People flying on brooms. Bizarre creatures and sporting events, moving staircases, talking paintings, devices which warned people if they had forgotten something. A secret platform between platforms 9 and 10 of King's Cross Station. And this had all been during Hermione's first year. What would the next 6 years be like? She had been looking forward to this day for a while. Her interviews had reached the point where Hermione had become convinced that Severus Snape had planned to steal the Philosopher's Stone for Voldemort. In retrospect, that assumption had proven to be inaccurate, as Snape had been a double agent for Dumbledore. To Snape's credit, the late potions master had been able to fool virtually everyone, including, most impressively, Voldemort himself. By the time Voldemort had found out, Snape had taken out most of his British minions in Operation Flying House. After a brief hesitation, Hermione had decided to move today's interview into the Gryffindor common room. The fat lady had nearly suffered a heart attack when she realized that Muggles were about to enter the sacred chamber. It had taken a lot of fast talking for Hermione to let Rowling come in with her. Hermione hadn't been kidding when she had said that the common room looked like it had been taken out of a 4-star hotel. The nights were getting cold, and a fireplace was burning merrily in the hearth. The place was tastefully decorated and littered with comfortable chairs. There were several students reading books and doing homework in the area, but they knew well enough not to interview with these interviews. Rowling brought out the quick quotes quill and began to ask questions. "All right, Hermione. You had reason to believe that Professor Snape was going to break into the third-floor corridor, get past the three-headed dog, and beat Professor Quirrell to the Philosopher's Stone. What happened next?" Hermione began to recount the tale. The first thing we had to do was make our way out of this tower and reach the room with Fluffy without being seen by any of the teachers or talkative students. Remember that corridor was off limits. There was a brief moment at the beginning when we ran into Neville Longbottom. He tried to stop us, claiming that we'd already cost Gryffindor a lot of points. We wound up being forced to hex him to make sure he stayed out of the way. Rowling blinked. You cast a spell on one of your own friends. Hermione nodded. We had no choice. If Voldemort had come back with the Philosopher's Stone, thousands of people would have been endangered. We realized we'd have to sacrifice Neville to save the world from Voldemort. At any rate, we neutralized Neville's threat, put on the invisibility cloak. J.K. Rowling nodded. Harry's cloak, the one which Moody confiscated as a powerful magical artifact. That's it. Since we were all young, all three of us fit under the cloak. We made our way over to the room with Fluffy to find the door already ajar. Obviously, Snape had gotten in before us. We made the dog fall asleep with some music and then headed down through the trap door. Rowling leaned forward, intent on the story, and you ran into Snape. All in good time, Ms. Rowling. We landed in a patch of Devil's Snare, a plant which tries to immobilize people which fall into it. We had some trouble there for a while, but I eventually remembered that this plant fears fire. We used a fire to get past it and encountered a room with thousands of flying keys. Flying keys. Yes, the task here, apparently, was to identify which key would open the door to the next chamber. Harry flew around for a while, looking for a key which had already been manhandled by Snape. Thanks to his strong Quidditch skills, he managed to track it down. We passed through that door and encountered a room with a life-sized chess set. Here, we had to take the place of 3 of the pieces and win the game. Only by winning the game would we be able to proceed. Rowling chuckled. You're good at chess, Hermione. Hermione scowled. I'm not that great. However, Ron is very good, which was good because we wouldn't have made it through were it not for him. Ron, however, found that he would have to sacrifice himself in order for us to win the game. He did so, and one of the enemy pieces hit him hard on the head and knocked him out. The piece hit him. It's wizard's chess, where the pieces are animated. We didn't want to leave Ron behind, but we had no choice. We decided that we'd continue on, get the stone, and then get Ron to the infirmary when we were done. You were prepared to sacrifice another friend for the cause. Like I said, we had no choice. The next obstacle was a troll similar to the one which attacked me in the bathroom, but the intruder had already knocked it unconscious. After that was a logic puzzle involving potions, and this is where Harry and I separated. You see, there was just enough of the correct potion to send one person on towards the stone. After a brief discussion with Harry, we agreed that he would continue on while I went back to deal with Ron. One 11-year-old boy against Professor Snape, or possibly Voldemort. Hermione laughed. It does sound a bit stupid in retrospect. However, we were kids. We didn't know better. At any rate, I headed back to the flying key room, took one of the brooms Harry had used to fly around chasing the keys, and continued on to pick up Ron. This proved problematic, however. Ron was still out cold, and I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to fly the broom while simultaneously making sure the unconscious Ron wouldn't fall off. And there was no way I was going to try using the levitation spell to have him hanging in midair behind me, banging his head on walls and the devil's snare on the way out. Leaving Ron behind on the chessboard, I flew out of the trapdoor and managed to clear the room a second before all 3 of Fluffy's heads would have converged on my throat. The next step was to find a teacher or make my way to the owlery to contact Dumbledore. As it so happened, I stumbled into Filch wandering the corridors. There was a brief moment of fear when he expelled me for flying around the corridors at night, and as far as he knew, injuring Ron. He said he'd contact McGonagall. Fine, I said, we'll get this all sorted out. McGonagall rescinded the suspension, but still docked Gryffindor 30 points for our going out of bounds. I explained what had happened, and described the evidence that someone had gotten past Fluffy. McGonagall was horrified, to say the least. She sent Filch to find Quirrell, and then sent a spell which I now recognize as a patronus somewhere to contact Dumbledore. We then returned to the third-floor corridor to check on Ron, who was still out. McGonagall cast some basic healing spells on him, and then whisked him off to Madame Pomfrey using a spell I didn't recognize. She then told me to go to bed and not to move for the rest of the night. As I turned to leave, I could have sworn I had heard Quirrell screaming that he couldn't touch something. I must have imagined it, I thought. McGonagall then said that she would stand guard in this room to make sure the intruder didn't have any accomplices coming in. It was at that point that Dumbledore came in. He looked furious and talked with McGonagall a little. He then barged in towards the room with the troll, intent on capturing the intruder or at least helping Quirrell. That was the last I saw, however. The rest, as you probably know, is history. We had no way to know that Quirrell had been the person after the stone to begin with. Nestor, Gabrielle, had enjoyed showing the Muggle around Nestor. What she had enjoyed even more had been the fact that the symptoms of morning sickness had started to abate. One would have expected that a country full of women and wizards would have figured out a spell to deal with morning sickness. The Muggle had been distracted by a few of her neighbors, of course, and she had to keep a tight leash on him to make sure he didn't stray too much. She found his story about the customs raid on the boat disturbing, and she confirmed his suspicion that something was most certainly not on the level. She then told him about the Círdan/Nestor war, at which point both of them realized it was probably an Círdani attempt at a naval blockade. This was disturbing, she thought. Círdan had reacted fairly quickly and not only imposed a naval blockade, but had also gotten some renegade merpeople to join their side. There were merpeople surrounding the island now, and the Coast Guard was watching them warily. So far, nothing had happened. However, how long would that be the case? She was still musing this when she heard a knock on her door. Puzzled, she went over to open it and saw 3 women in military robes. She froze. Was this what she thought it was? The woman in the front spoke. "Are you Gabrielle Jumeirah?" Gabrielle licked her lips. "Yes, how can I help?" The woman talked over her. "We are here to inform you that your number has come up in the Nestorian military draft. You will be joining Luisa Longa's division, supporting the Coast Guard. As of this moment, you are a member of the Coast Guard. You have 10 minutes to gather your belongings and come with us." She had been afraid of this. Hoping against hope, she pointed at her belly. "I'm pregnant, ma'am. I'm not sure if this is a good idea." "If you're pregnant, you will serve in the medical wing or somewhere else which will not harm the baby. It is possible to serve the country without holding a Muggle weapon or a wand, after all. Think of it this way, Gabrielle. The alternative would be arrest for desertion, and I doubt you'd want that." Shit, she thought. Telling the women she'd go with them quietly, she started packing some of her most valuable possessions. The thing which had been most troubling of all had not been the fact that she was now part of the Coast Guard. It was the fact that they hadn't mentioned how long her term would be. Chapter 449, The Isaac Sanders Show. Friday, November 28, 1996. Merpeople Assembler Octorattle. The great council chamber was getting overcrowded, as leaders of most of the 1,000 tribes showed up to swear under oaths their innocence in the current Nestor incident, under the watchful gaze of outsider observers, including a nervous Vila. The more well-informed of them also kept shooting, accusing looks towards Avernus, Archon of Trapananda, who was presently hovering beside the eldest, engaged in a private conversation. "I must say, I'm glad for your silencing spell," said Roctorattle's head of state in an almost shouting voice, earning a question in an equally loud tone from his fellow ruler. "Let me guess, Markali sent a howler your way too. Now, you said you have a question." "Indeed," said the eldest. "While the merpeople seen in Nestor looked like normal tribesfolk, I can't help but feel there is more than meets the eye. I've already heard almost all relevant Atlantic tribal leader swear they aren't behind it. By relevant, I mean ethnicity, as far as the Vila managed to identify it, and access to any Drider walkers. Wait, interrupted the Merwizard monarch. You say the rumors are true. Anyone waltzing into this city could buy one of those constructs. Man, it's insanely careless. Any mage worth his galleon could take a working civilian mecha and enchant it full of shields and cursed weapons. We did not expect you to come in the picture, the eldest confessed with a sigh. The machines are only good for merpeople pilots, and until you entered the picture, we had neither wizards nor idiots who dared to call our wrath, delivered by professionally equipped battle driders down on themselves by retrofitting our peaceful tools for war. But of course, your baby-snatching lot had to get involved and screw up a working system. Never mind. Just tell me you can do something if they do turn out to be your renegades. No promises here, regretfully replied Avernus. Since Círdan took them in, we can't just go and arrest them again. Legal formalities and all that. Add the fact that Nestor did indeed smuggle weapons in from the USA to support an aggressive war. That's exactly the situation we all want to distance ourselves from. So no, as long as they don't do something globally threatening, we don't do anything to the renegades. And here I am, shocked to hear this from the man who just last week pointed out to me how impotent Atlantis is because of their only dealing with global threats policy. You hear, young man, shocked. Somewhere between Nestor and Círdan Atlantic Ocean, the albatross had been half-cooked by the flames that ended its life, and half-rotten after a few days in the water, but somehow no sea creature touched it. The Merwizards noticed it exactly for this reason. It was unnatural, and clearly the result of some warding magic, and thus warranting further attention. They soon found the letter fastened to the bird's legs, and now it was in the hands of Racer, who managed to restore it to vaguely legible condition by some clever spells. Dear Myrtil, I'm glad to inform you that Mother finally saw the light, and now she approves of your boyfriend. She kind of fell to the other extreme, actually. Now she keeps asking when the wedding will be, and keeps going on about how you're supposed to hold on to your luck once you manage to wrap a pureblood wizard, and one of the wealthiest men in the hidden nations at that, around your fingers despite your pitiful magical powers. I hope you don't mind. Personally, I think it's still better than her past ramblings about how you stain the Trepanir name by associating with a Círdani. Speaking about Círdan, please don't go near that place. I've heard from reliable sources that a real nasty and real unexpected stormy season is about to start there any minute now. It'd be awful if you or any of your friends got into trouble there. Your loving sister, Veronique. Racer chuckled. No doubt, the shady talk about a stormy season was a code for the Vila invasion of Círdan. Well, judging by the messenger albatross's most likely Vila-induced fiery death, this could mean the addressed one could actually be in Círdan, receiving some extremely unpleasant and ironic experience if his gut feeling was right. Saturday, November 30, 1996, Stern Residentius Scottsdale, as United States of America Atlantis DEFCON status. 345% next up. He'd though that Izzy had gone in over his head once he had gotten involved with the wizards to begin with. But this was different. He was going to be one of the stars of a real-life documentary, a so-called reality show about a muggle living among and interacting with wizards. Granted, Izzy had already learned a lot about wizards prior to the filming of the first show. As a result, he wouldn't be as clueless as some of the NBC producers had hoped he would have been. However, that role could easily be filled by Izzy's wife, Melissa. She didn't know as much about the wizards as Izzy did, just the little she picked up teaching Muggle studies at Fourth Mesa. Not that she was teaching right now. Of course, she was on maternity leave, and she would be on maternity leave for a good month more. Sanders had told him that he didn't really like it all that much to have all of those Muggle video cameras in his face, especially since they need to provide 2 or 3 times the normal number due to the tendency of Muggle video equipment to malfunction in a magical environment. He and his wife did want privacy, especially with a 2-month-old baby in the house. Unfortunately, that wasn't going to happen. Little Hermione Sanders was already one of the stars of the show, and photographs of her with magical toys were already making the rounds on various NBC commercials. So far, the Isaac Sanders show had been quite popular. It had gotten so popular, in fact, that people had begun clamoring for a scenario where a wizard moved to a Muggle-only area and began interacting with the Muggles. With all of the video equipment already in Fourth Mesa, various Fourth Mesa personnel would likely be good candidates. The Navajo, aka Dine Nation, which surrounded Fourth Mesa, was in favor of having a Fourth Mesa employee be the star because it would show the world what being a Native American was truly like. Unfortunately, there hadn't been many wizards brave enough to try living in a Muggle area yet. So the second show would have to wait. Stern was more or less accustomed to life working for MT St. Helens now. Granted, he had lost 10 galleons betting on the eruption during the Thanksgiving Day quadpart game. For God's sake, they should have kept the exploding ball in there. However, for the most part, the people were quite supportive of him and his Muggle friends. Not quite supportive enough to start living somewhere like Seattle, but still much better than he had anticipated. There were some wizarding supremacists hiding in MT St. Helens, but they were few and far between. Stern had taken Sanders's plans for a Muggle studies class and tweaked them a little. He'd had a whole unit on Muggle technology, computers, cars, airplanes, etc. There were a couple of days on fashion. People had come in the next day in tuxedos, pink ones, one on medicine, one on careers, and one on games and hobbies. He discussed what he knew of the hopefully defunct America for Humans anti-wizarding group and its political arm, the Revelation Party. All in all, he thought he had done pretty well enough to possibly get called back next year. At the stroke of 6:00, the screen switched to an overhead shot of the Fourth Mesa region and had special effects cause a mountain filled with magical buildings to appear out of nowhere. The theme song played as the camera made its way through Fourth Mesa hallways filled with owls, floating candles, and so forth, into a fireplace. There was a flash of green light meant to indicate flu travel, and when it disappeared it showed Sanders, his wife, and the baby living in their Muggle home in Prescott. All three people were identified by name as the camera flew its way back to Fourth Mesa and began identifying other people the Sanderses tended to interact with: Strong Bear, Two Bear, Willis, and some others. Finally, it panned out one last time show the name of the program in a magically fanciful font: The Isaac Sanders Show. The camera focused on Melissa and the baby making their way out of the fireplace. The title card appeared: 1 month checkup. Although Sanders hadn't been able to say exactly what had been filmed, he had told Stern that Melissa had taken Hermione in to one of the healers in Fourth Mesa for a standard 1-month checkup given to all babies in a wizarding environment. Supposedly they cast spells on the child and used them to determine how healthy the child was. The child was also given charms which would help strengthen the child's ability to ward off diseases. Stern figured that these were the equivalent of childhood vaccines. He had no idea if wizards needed to get booster charms as adults, however. Fortunately, he figured that he was about to find out. The narrator explained what was going on as the camera followed Melissa through the labyrinthine corridors of Fourth Mesa. Today is an important day for little Hermione Sanders, her 1-month checkup. It is standard practice in the wizarding world for all children to be given simple medical checkups 1 month after they are born. Melissa is somewhat nervous, however. The narrator's voice was replaced by a Melissa voiceover. I have no idea what they're going to do. Sure, they say it's safe. However, is Hermione going to get all the vaccines and so forth she'll need? What happens if the wizards don't know about mumps and their checkup doesn't include the equivalent of a mumps vaccine? The narrator's voice came back. To the best of our knowledge, diseases are less common in wizarding children than they are in Muggle children. In fact, studies show that children die before age 2 a good 20% less often in the wizarding world than in the Muggle world. We don't know if the wizards include a mumps vaccine, but we should know shortly. Melissa brought the baby into an office with lots of potions lining the walls. Several of them were releasing green smoke into the air, and the camera caught a shot of Melissa looking at the smoke in alarm. There was a brief moment of silence, during which the narrator added, "Second-hand smoke issues." Melissa put down the baby as the healer walked into the room. "Good evening, Melissa. How is Little Feather?" Little Feather, in case you forgot, is Hermione's Dine name. Many of the shamans here use the Dine names as their primary name. People like Strong Bear have English names, for instance. Strong Bear is Alexander Parkman, but they don't use them often. Melissa looked at the baby. That charm you cast on her the other day is starting to have an effect. Her sleep cycle now matches ours. She goes to bed at 7 p.m. and wakes up in the morning like we do. Granted, there are times that she wakes up screaming in the middle of the night, and I have to get up and feed her. I don't suppose there's a milk substitute that you can magically whip up. The healer winced. There is, but it's not as good as the original. We don't recommend it unless the mother can't produce milk. Melissa grunted. Oh well, so what are you going to do? We may have to adapt the procedures somewhat since she's a muggle, we'll see. However, here's what's going to happen. We're going to cast some spells on her and see how she reacts to them. They may surprise her a little, but they won't hurt her. They're going to test her reflexes and so forth. Next, we're going to cast a spell on her, which will check for common childhood conditions, such as jaundice. Finally, we're going to give her a charm which will help strengthen her immune system to the point where it will be able to fight off old diseases, such as rubella, mumps, measles, and so forth. Melissa nodded. That's the equivalent of our vaccines, right? Correct, with the advantage that you don't have to get a booster shot with it. The wizarding treatment is also painless. I've been told that Muggle children cry a lot when they receive vaccines. Is that true? Melissa nodded and looked around the room again. Let's hope the second-hand smoke doesn't kill her first, before continuing. How long is this going to take? The healer shrugged. Maybe half an hour. You can stay with the child the whole time if you wish. Melissa smiled. Good, I don't want her out of my sight. One question, however. Is it wise to have those potions spewing smoke into the room? I know as a muggle that cigarette smoke can be harmful to your health. The healer laughed. Don't worry, those are harmless. Those potions are in fact herbal aromatherapy tinctures. They won't harm you, me, or the child. Now let's get started. Undress the baby while I start casting some spells. Kamchatka Peninsula. Igor Romanov frowned as the reports came in from the people scouring the area. Sure, there had been giant tracks around here. However, there wasn't any evidence that Blackguard cultists or Death Eaters had been in the area. The only name that the investigators had turned up was Mab, a half-crazy witch who had supposedly been possessing people since Shakespeare's time. He looked at his aide. Could this Mab be involved with the Death Eaters or Rasputin? The aide shrugged. I have no idea, Your Highness. From what I've heard, she's a bit too unstable to be a reliable ally. She seems to change her mind every few days, almost as if she has a split personality. Split personality. Correct, Your Highness. To make a long story short, she's nuts. She's not a threat as far as I can tell. Igor drummed his fingers on his chair. Maybe the Death Eaters or Rasputin will ally with her, and she'll do something which will expose herself and them. Do you think that's a possibility? The aide thought for a moment. It's plausible. However, I would suspect that as soon as her psychological problems start manifesting themselves, our quarry will drop her like a stolen wand. Igor looked out the window of his winterized magical tent. It may have been freezing outside, but here it was actually balmy. How is the Unified Korean Ministry of Magic doing? They're searching as well, I've been told. The aide smiled. For a ministry which was hit with a nuclear weapon and is in the process of reuniting with North Korea, they're doing a pretty good job. Unfortunately, they've come up empty as well. Ignore nodded sharply and made up his mind. Keep on looking. The fact that we've got these MAB references here could mean that she tried to link up with these guys and blew their cover. If you find anything, report it immediately. The aide saluted. As you command, Your Highness.